in or near poverty. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from 4 of the candidates for governor: Rob Astorino, Andrew Giuliani, Tom Suozzi, and Jimani Williams, and give them an opportunity to lay out their plans to address hunger, poverty, and nutrition in our state. Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin were also invited to attend this forum, but they opted not to attend.
As a quick note for you, we will be providing interpretation of this event into 8 languages, including Spanish, Bengali, Mandarin, Cantonese, Haitian Creole, Russian, and Urdu. To access those services, if you want to hear it in one of those languages, you click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It's a little globe over to the right at the bottom of your screen. You can select and click on your preferred language. We'll also have ASL interpretation available throughout the event. You also have an option to enable live transcription of the event at any time. And so with that, let's get started.
Thanks, Errol. So our first candidate tonight is Tom Suozzi. He is a congressman who represents the 3rd Congressional District on Long Island, and he's vying for the Democratic nomination for governor in the June primary. So, Congressman, why don't we begin by having you introduce your history as it pertains to these issues?
Well, I want to thank you, Susan and Errol, for hosting us tonight. And thank you to Hunger Free America and all the different sponsors that do so much good work to help so many people in need. You bring miracles into people's lives when they're suffering the most. My professional career, I'm trained as a certified public accountant and attorney. I was the mayor of my hometown, the county executive of Nassau County, where I ran one of the biggest health and human service agencies in the country. I've been in Congress for the past 5.5 years, but I've always been thinking about these issues for most of my life. Certainly as a young boy, but I was also a supervisor at a shelter when I was going to law school at Fordham Law School in the Upper West Side. I used to sleep overnight and help to supervise the shelter on occasion. And I would make sandwiches for the homeless shelter and the soup kitchen. And I started a program in law school called the Fordham Law School Public Service Project, which got more students to volunteer to do that type of work. And I knew from then through my life now that the work that everybody's doing on this call is so important and it helps so many people, but we need to have systemic changes to address the problems of poverty and hunger. And I've tried to work on those issues throughout my career. But 2 brief things that I would want to talk about tonight are something I did as Nassau County executive, where I took 8 agencies: social services, health, mental health, veterans, seniors, youth, physically challenged, and drug and alcohol. And they were scattered across 5 buildings. I put them into 1 building. And I said, let's create a thing called No Wrong Door, where if you come in the front door looking for a transfer payment, a welfare check, or food stamps, or a housing choice voucher, or heat assistance, let's try and find out what brought you to this point and see what we can do with all the services that exist to actually help people and actually help solve the problems that they face. And secondly, the other issue I'd like to talk about is related to food markets. I was down at the just campaign this past weekend at the Union Square food market, and it was farmers market. And I talked to a guy named Bob Lewis, who used to work for the Department of Agriculture. And he set up that farmers market back in the 1980s. And I remember going to that farmers market when I was living in the city. And he talked about how it can be such a win-win-win for people who need access to fresh produce, because obesity is such a problem. Food stamps often buy products that cost less money, that aren't as healthy for you. But at a farmer's stand, a farmer's market, you can get those products for cheaper. It's a win for the farmers because you're connecting the rural areas to the urban areas, and it's a win for the people overall. So let me just take any questions that you may have for me.
I wanted to start, Congressman, by talking about a quote from you from 2016. You said that if you're making $150,000 a year on Long Island, you're struggling, or Nassau County, you said you're struggling. So to be considered to be living in poverty in America, including in New York State, a family of 3 would have an income less than $21,720. So if you're making $21,720. In Nassau, what does that say if
It's
150,000 is struggling?
It's absolutely devastating for families. That's why I've devoted so much of my life to the labor movement, for example, trying to increase people's wages, trying to make sure that if you're willing to work hard every day, you can make enough money so you can afford to live in the place that you live, where you can afford housing, where you can afford health insurance, where you can afford to educate your children, where you can afford to retire one day. The problem is there are so many people in New York State that can't do that. They can't possibly have a place to live and have health insurance and have a retirement or pay for extracurricular activities for their kids. People are struggling every day, and inflation is making it worse. New York State has the highest taxes in the United States of America. That affects not only owners, but renters as well, because of the taxes that are being paid by the landlords. We have some of the highest utility rates in the country that are going up every day. And we have the national problem related to just basic food costs and inflation for gas prices and everyday staples. So there are a lot of people suffering regularly. And I've devoted a big part of my life to trying to help lift people up out of poverty.
Let me follow up with a related question, Congressman. The minimum wage in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester, the lower part of the state here, it's $15 an hour. In the rest of upstate New York, it's currently $13.20 an hour. Unless you're a fast food worker, they get $15 an hour. So I guess it's really a three-part question. Considering the cost of living in New York, what do you consider to be a living wage? Would you support an immediate increase in the upstate minimum so that other workers are getting at least as much as fast food workers? And do you support indexing the minimum wage to include a cost of living adjustment?
Yes, I do. The challenge is that we face a big problem in our country because 26 states still have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. To put that in perspective, if you make $10 an hour and you work 40 hours a week and you work 50 weeks a year, that's only $20,000 a year. You can't possibly survive, as you pointed out with the poverty rate here in New York State, making $20,000 a year, or at $15 an hour comes out to $30,000 a year, and you're still struggling to survive, certainly downstate New York, especially, but really throughout the state. And I do support the idea of increasing people's wages, but we have to recognize that people are leaving our state because the cost of living here is so high. So we have to figure out how can we balance our desire to serve the people that live here in New York against the competition we're facing from lower cost states. That's why federal policy is so important on these issues, that we have national policy related to minimum wage, national policy related to taxes. I'm a big supporter of increasing taxes at the federal level, especially after the cuts that were done in 2017. Increase the taxes at the federal level. The problem is if we increase them just here in New York State, then we end up with people continuing to leave our state because they can't afford to live here. It's a very tough balance. One of the reasons I'm running for governor is so I can have a national voice on these issues that are so important.
Would a higher wage, in your opinion, would it drive jobs out of the state, or would it attract workers to this state from some of those low wage neighbors that you were talking about?
Well, the big challenge that we're facing is that when you increase the wages, you also increase the cost of government. You increase a lot of the services. Now, you want people to have a living wage. We just went through this whole debate with childcare, where we increased the wages of childcare workers. The state wouldn't give the advocates as much money as they were requesting, which they felt was necessary for childcare workers to have a living wage. The advocates are really upset. They're really angry about the fact that they didn't get nearly what they were seeking. The problem is that the state is already the highest tax state in the United States of America. I believe that we have to go after the waste, fraud, and abuse where we have in Medicaid, for example, 2.5 times the cost of the national average, bigger than Florida and Texas combined. Florida and Texas are both bigger than New York. We have 2.5 times the cost of the national average. We spend more on Medicaid than those two states combined, even though they're bigger than we are. We spend more per student than any state in the United States of America, but our education results are not better than the rest of the state. So there's always a balance between these different things. How can we serve our people within our state while keeping us competitive, that people aren't leaving our state because it's too expensive to live here? I believe to do that, we have to be willing to fight fights against the insiders, because right now we've had no competition in New York State for decades. There's a reason we have the highest taxes in America. There's a reason that we have people leaving our state in droves. There's a reason we have a rising crime rate. It's all tied to the corruption of our state, the most corrupt state in the United States of America. We have to be willing to fight. When I was Nassau County executive, I fought the police union, even though I support the cops, but I fought the police union because they have the highest wages they had the highest wages of any law enforcement in the country. But I fought them so I could take that savings and plow it into health and human services. We need to be doing that in New York State, where we fight some of these insider groups that control the budget of the state and fight to help the folks that are suffering the most. I've got a record of doing that.
Congressman, I just want to clarify. Errol asked if you would support indexing the minimum wage to include a cost of living adjustment, and you would.
Yes.
Okay. My question is this: about 1 in 3 New York State voters live in or near poverty, earning $50,000 or less annually. Since the pandemic started, the number of New Yorkers unable to afford sufficient food more than doubled. And that's about 1 in 4 state residents, or 4.5 million New Yorkers facing food hardship. What specific steps would you take as governor to decrease poverty and hunger and boost nutrition? And I also have some other related questions, but let's start there.
Well, the really shocking thing is, Susan, is that those figures are actually misleading, because of the fact that if you make under $50,000 in New York State, or you make under the poverty level for the country in New York State, you're much worse off than many other states, because our costs are so much higher here in New York State. So, the poverty rate, which I think it's $27,000, in some places in the country, you're a lot better off than you are in New York, because it's so expensive to live here. So we have to figure out how to work on affordability generally in New York State, especially with regressive costs like utility rates, gas prices, and property taxes for those people that are owners. A lot of times people are house rich but income poor. We also have to lift up people's wages in the private sector by encouraging unions. We've created enormous wealth in the United States of America and in New York State since the end of the 1980s. The Dow Jones has gone up 1,900%. The GDP has gone up 1,000% since the end of the 1980s. But workers' wages have gone up less than 20%. That's directly tied to the diminution of unions throughout the country. That's why I'm the chair of the Labor Caucus in Congress. I'm a very big supporter of the efforts to organize that we see taking place with Starbucks and Amazon and other profitable companies that are making tremendous amounts of wealth, but they're not sharing it with the people who go to work every day.
Now, some people don't go to work every day and they are on public assistance. Would you commit to indexing public assistance benefits to inflation to meet the increased cost of living expenses?
Yes, but we have to come up with the money. To come up with the money, we have to be willing to fight the corruption and the insiders of New York State that currently exist. I'm the only candidate in this race that's a proven executive, as a former CPA and attorney, former mayor, former county executive, who has fought against corruption my entire career. I started a thing called fixalbany.com that Errol's well aware of back in the 2000s, where I took on Shelley Silver and Joe Bruno and the state legislature to try and root out waste, fraud, and abuse and corruption in New York State, especially in the area of Medicaid. But we got a long way to go.
I'm old enough to remember that. So will you also commit, and then I'm going to throw it back to Errol, to supporting universal school meals in public schools?
Yes, and we have to consider creating meals that are kosher and halal as well in the schools. And that also, we have to take the lead from Mayor Adams and look at creating much more healthy meals in schools so that kids learn good eating habits at a young age. Everything is about children at a young age. My health and human services idea, my no wrong door idea, one of the most important things that I want to do, the most passionate thing I have in my agenda, is to bring health and human services into our schools. Because as Bishop Desmond Tutu used to say, and Eric Adams uses this quote often, we spend a lifetime pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and stop people from falling in the river in the first place. We must help children in schools get the health and human services they need at a young age, because it's better to educate a child instead of paying for a jail cell later on. Everybody claps for that speech, but it doesn't happen. Why? Because most politicians don't know how to run things. I know how to run things and get things done, and I've got the heart to help the people and to fight on their behalf.
Congressman, you have called for tax cuts. If you reduce state revenue, wouldn't that make it harder and put pressure on your ability to provide programs to low-income New Yorkers like you just described?
There's no question it'll be harder, but it's a fight we have to have. We have to change the culture of New York State. People are leaving our state in droves because they can't afford to live here. Not only low-income, impoverished people, but middle-class people and wealthy people. They're leaving our state. When I was born, there were 45 members of Congress from New York State. I was born in 1962. I'm much older than the two of you are. And today, we don't have 45 members of Congress. We have 27 members of Congress, and we're going down to 26 in January 1st of 2023. We are losing influence in the state. When we lose influence, we lose access to bringing more money back from the federal government to the state of New York. We have to reduce the costs here.
So Nourish New York, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but it's a program in which food banks actually buy food from farms and distribute it through their networks. And it has a budget line now, I think about $50 million, if I'm not mistaken. It's been very successful. Would you commit to funding the Nourish New York program every year?
Yeah, I'd also commit to doing a lot better job of working with our farmers throughout the state. You know, we've gone from 106,000 farmers in the 50s to about 33,000 farmers today. The number of acres that we actually use for farming has been cut in less than half during that same period of time. I actually created farms in Nassau County, if you can imagine, when I was county executive, organic farms that were cooperatives on county property run by private sector folks that are still in existence 20 years later. We have to create more farms, and we have to create more connection between the farmers and the schools and urban areas. And we need to create marketplaces where there's a place for people to buy fresh, healthy produce and goods. That's a big initiative. You know, the mayor talked about investing money in Hunts Point, which is a great idea for wholesale. But we need to be doing it on a retail level and trying to encourage more farmers markets, more access to retail produce and goods from farms sourced here in New York State.
And also upstate, not just in New York City, right?
Oh, no, everywhere in the state, every single part of the state, we have to do that. And listen, obesity is a major problem. What's the leading causes of death, premature death for people? Smoking, drinking, and poor eating habits. If we want to be the healthiest state in the United States of America, we've got to address those three issues constantly. And correct eating habits and access to fresh produce and healthy food is a very, very big part of that. Affordable food. And doing it at farmers markets is a very good way to do that. Bringing it into schools is a very good way to do that. Often, you know, like organic supermarkets or healthy food in supermarkets is much more expensive and not affordable for low-income people. You've got to try and make it accessible to people in retail spaces of farmers markets and available to kids in schools and in hospitals and any other institution you can. I know how to run things. I'll know how to make those connections happen.
Congressman, I want to thank you so much for your time on behalf of all of the food programs that are sponsoring this event.
Well, let me close by just saying thank you to all of your sponsors. I saw the many names that are on there, and I know that they're saving people's lives and they do great work on a regular basis. So thank you for everything that everybody does. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Do we have our next candidate? Are we ready to go?
I can keep talking if you want me to.
That's all right, Tom. I'm here.
Okay. All right. There
Okay,
it is.
Jumani's here. All right, I love Jumani. How are you, Jumani?
Peace and blessings, Tom.
Thank you, my brother.
Okay. That voice familiar to many of you is Jimani Williams. He is the public advocate of New York City. Previously, he served on the New York City Council, representing the 45th District for 9 years. He's now a candidate seeking the Democratic nomination to become governor. He'll be on the ballot in the June primary. And welcome. Let's give you a chance, Mr. Williams, to introduce yourself to the folks who are watching and tell us very briefly about your history working on issues involving hunger and anti-poverty.
Thank you so much, Errol and Susan. Peace and blessings, love and light to everyone's here. As mentioned, public advocate of the city of New York. And I've been working on issues of hunger, poverty, in particular for most of my career, even before the council and after the council, trying to make sure that our budgets actually reflect the things that we say it should reflect, making sure that kids are able to eat should be the basis of that. And if we don't understand now, after this pandemic, the connection and intersection of things like hunger, things like food scarcity and public safety, we never will. And one of the reasons I decided to run is because I keep hearing, our leaders say we have to return to normal, and I keep saying to them that normal didn't work for most people in New York State. We've been dealing with poverty issues and hunger issues for a very long time. So I want to normalize people's lives. But I don't want to go back to normal because that's kind of what got us here. And so we need to have a governor who's in office understanding that normal didn't work for the people who are hungry and don't have either enough food or literally any food when it comes time to eat.
Okay. Your campaign website says, and I'm quoting here, "I will fight to close the loophole that allows employers to pay tipped workers abysmal wages that have service workers struggling to make ends meet," close quote. Now, state law does allow the governor to unilaterally do this. If elected governor, would you take executive action to close that loophole?
That's definitely my intention. I do know that there are some folks who have some issue with that. I haven't been persuaded yet, but I do want to continue to listen. But right now, as it stands, it sounds like we should be trying to figure out how to close that. But again, I always want to listen to the people who are closest to the ground. And so if people could provide some different information of how that would be more harmful, it's something that I definitely want to consider.
Well, yeah, as you may have heard, there are a lot of people who work in the hospitality industry who rely on tipped wages, and in some cases prefer it. Certain kind of gig workers, and depending on where you are, it's actually, in their opinion, a decent way to make a living. What would you say to them?
Well, we also are toying, within the campaign to figure out if there's different places we can do it. Are there different sectors? Are there different amounts of people who work at the location? So we're trying to see if there's a way that maybe it's not a one size fits all, but we do know just as there are some people that it benefits, there are some people that it harms. And so we have to try to really take a look at that.
Okay.
So Jimani Williams, if you're elected governor, there are several different ways that you could address poverty. And one of them is indexing public assistance benefits to inflation to meet increased cost of living expenses. Would you do that?
We have to index most things that have to do with how people are accessing resources. So minimum wage is one of them. And of course, as you're mentioning, making sure that people and the support that they get are also indexed. We see that everything goes up, but wages don't go up and assistance doesn't go up. $15 an hour, people, sometimes look at it as a lot. Well, people laughed at us when we said we want to have minimum wage $15 an hour for people who are in fast food. But when you look at how close it actually is to the meager poverty line of the state, it doesn't really make any sense that that's where it would stay. And that just goes for assistance that people get as well. So I believe it has to be indexed to make it work.
Do you think it should be raised to $18 an hour or even higher? I mean, what is a livable wage in your opinion?
Obviously, it depends on the way you're looking. New York has now become the highest place to live in the country. It used to be places in LA and in San Francisco. The annual rent in New York City is $45,000. In Nassau County is $35,000. If you're getting $15 an hour, that doesn't cut it, right? Even if you're making about $50,000 an hour, that won't cut it. You can see why people don't have the ability after they've paid rent to make sure they eat well. We haven't even talked about medicine. We haven't talked about transportation. We haven't talked about taking some time off for yourself and your family. And that's it has to do with mental health and a reprieve. And so I do think it has to be indexed to things like productivity, to things like how much things are costing, how much people are making in general. But it probably has to go up over $20, and it has to happen very quickly. But you would see then, once you do the math, that itself is not as much as people think. And I will add, every time we have these conversations about raising the minimum wage, we talk about how businesses are going to flee, they're going to shutter. And it doesn't happen. I will say I'm uniquely, I believe, situated in many of these situations because not only have I worked for these low wages at times, I've also been a business owner. And so I understand the struggles and trying to find the right balance.
Another way of supporting people who are living on the minimum wage is to make it easier to qualify for SNAP benefits. Currently in New York, you have to be at 150% of the federal poverty level in order to get the benefits, but different states do it differently. Our neighbor, Vermont, for example, is at 185% of the federal poverty level. Would you commit, if elected, to raising the income level in New York for when families are eligible for SNAP?
Oh, I absolutely would. And I think we may need to find some state money to actually supplement some of the federal money that we're getting so we can get more people the assistance that they need.
Jimani Williams, there are hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who are eligible for federally funded SNAP benefits, but don't receive them for one reason or another. And basically billions of dollars of food benefits are not going to the people who need them. Do you think that the state should spend maybe a little money helping state agencies and their nonprofit partners to get the word out about enrolling for SNAP?
We lose a lot of money, as you mentioned, to several benefits. Actually, SNAP is definitely one of them that we end up not being able to use, and we lose it. What we've found during the pandemic is something we always knew, actually, is that our local community-based organizations, our mutual aid organizations, fill the gap what government does. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of areas where these organizations do better than government when provided the proper structure and proper funding. So we absolutely should be using folks who are culturally competent and can get to spaces that many people can't, to let people know what's available to them because they simply may not know. And sometimes people may not understand it, but actually even applying for some of these things can be daunting if you're not used to interfacing with government. So 1000%.
Let me ask you about something that comes up a lot with some of the programs that are represented here. And it's a broad sort of strategic and almost philosophical question. We've got two different kinds of food programs in New York. You have charitable and sort of retail. For example, food banks are charitable, whereas SNAP is retail. There's a move to get more people off the charitable sort of food bank model and onto retail, onto long-term benefits. Currently, there are food pantries in schools, including CUNY, actually. But if, for example, you increase SNAP benefits or you increase wages, there'd be fewer people who needed those food pantries. I'm wondering how you think about the pros and cons of those approaches.
Sadly, I'm not sure that we're even at a place where you have to make those decisions yet. And I would also, say most people who do this kind of nonprofit work would love to work themselves out of business. So if we got to a place where people were making enough money that they didn't need any of those services, it would be great. But I actually think we do need both of them. I've seen and encountered people who are doing both kind of work. During this pandemic, I think you couldn't sometimes tell whether it was a COVID testing line or a food pantry line. And so I think both are needed. We're often trying to choose between one or the other in services. And that's very often because funding is not there. Unfortunately, we've seen people who provide the food pantry services you provide. I know Masbia and places like that actually, it's so great how they do it. You come in, it's like you're going to a restaurant or you're going to a grocery store. The humanity that's provided is an awesome place to get that kind of service. And we need both of them. And frankly, we have the ability to get both of them. Here in the state, unfortunately, we had a budget that doesn't really reflect where we are. And that's because we have a huge fear of raising the revenue that we need from the people who have it, so that we can make sure people have the basics that they need to survive.
So you would advocate for raising taxes on the wealthy?
There is no way, it's absolutely no way to do what we need to do in New York without raising revenue, period. Even the things that are good in this budget, and they're not where they should be, they'll put in what they call the out years. And so that money is not real. It is something that you have to do in passing budgets because you can't have all the money now. But if you don't get a governor that commits to raising revenue, when we lose this federal money, some of them which is one shot, those are the first programs that are going to get cut. So it's great in an election year, but in the out years, folks are going to suffer. What I do know is that the people who are leaving are not the wealthy. They're the people who can't afford food and can't afford to live someplace. And so we have to help by lowering many of the tax rates for middle, struggling, working class. I've sued the mayor of New York City to try to balance some of that out. But in exchange for that, if we can't raise the revenue from the people who've made $200 billion a year, $200 billion after the pandemic, where are we going to get it from? So anyone that doesn't have discussion is not being honest about what New York State needs or how we're going to get it.
So you just said that the people who are leaving New York are not the wealthiest, or you said that they're more of modest means, but there is some data that would suggest that wealthy people, some are leaving the state. Nothing is conclusive here, but I was wondering how you would respond to a question about, what if people do start leaving the state, the people who provide much of the state's tax revenue?
Well, the governor's own budget director, after she made a statement that we're not going to raise taxes, we want you to come back, actually refuted that and said that there's no evidence that millionaires and billionaires have left. I know one that's in Mar-a-Lago, he can stay there. But overall, the people who have left, we've seen, reverse migration in Black communities for several years now. The people who are leaving simply can't stay here. What I would say is this: the conversation has to be about civic responsibility. It has to be about people doing what they can with what they have where they are. If we all can't do that, then we're all going to survive, not going to survive. And I will also say, I don't want our wealthy folks to leave New York State. I don't want anyone to leave New York State. I also don't want people to live in New York State in poverty, where they can't eat, where they can't live, where they can't get health care, where our public safety is not viewed in the way that addresses those things, but tries to fix on the back end what we can do on the front end. So we can't keep trying to protect the wealthy donors on the backs of everyone else. There is a conversation that brings us in as a civic conversation where we can include everyone.
Thank you.
I've got a rural question for you. The number of acres farmed in our state has declined dramatically over the last few decades. Do you think that's a problem? And if so, what would you do to reverse or at least stem that trend?
I fell in love with this state when I ran for lieutenant governor in 2018. It's just a beautiful, amazing state that has everything you will need in every kind of culture and things that you want to see in the state, including farmland. I do think it's a concern that we're losing farmland. I do think we have to subsidize much more of our farmers, not just so we can get farmland, but so that we can make sure people who are on those farms can get paid a wage that they can feed their families as well. Like I said, there is no way to do this that doesn't include revenue raising. Anyone who says that there is just not being honest, and is part of the reason that we got here to begin with. So we've been very clear with our transformative economy where it is we can get this revenue raised if we have a governor that has the courage to push back on people who don't want to do it.
If you were able to raise that revenue as governor, Jumaane, do you think, how would you use it to increase the number of farmers or to help farmers who are struggling in the state?
Well, a lot of times they're struggling because they can't get enough to pay the bills, then to further farm. And we're asking more of them, rightfully so, to make sure that people have a workday that's healthy and get paid for the work they're doing. And we have to subsidize some of those. We subsidize a lot of things in the state. We subsidize market rate housing. We subsidize, we're about to subsidize another $1 billion for a stadium that does not produce the kind of economic activity that we want to see. All the economists say that. We subsidize a lot of things that are not helpful to New Yorkers, whether it's IDAs, whether it's 421A, billions and billions of dollars. We can subsidize directly to New Yorkers to provide an economy that makes sense, that helps farmers, that helps people work there, and helps the people who want to get their produce. You know, it's important that we in-house as much as possible in this state from food to table. It's healthy, it's doable, in so many ways beneficial to the state. That's a much better place to subsidize than, say, a Buffalo Bills stadium.
And I guess just to wrap up, I mean, let me ask you a question I'm sure you have heard on the streets. You've served in the New York City Council for nearly a decade. You've been the public advocate. And during that time, hunger and poverty have remained persistent problems. Do you think you have any responsibility for that? And is there something you wish you could have gotten your colleagues in government to do to address these problems?
I personally think we all have a responsibility, all of us that are in government. So I always include myself, and I do my best to try to push further and harder. One of the reasons, you know, I always say, I think I have a pretty cool job as public advocate, so I'm excited about it. I don't know that I need another job. One of the reasons I'm running is something that you're touching on. I have tried to use all of the tools at my disposal, whether it's as a council member or as a public advocate, to push these issues. And I figured, you know what, maybe I can just actually be the person that can just get it done instead of the person who's advocating and pushing. And that's one of the reasons I'm running for governor, because the questions you're asking have very legitimate and concrete answers. The things that's preventing it from happening are usually people donating to folks that want to buy policy that's harmful to most of New Yorkers, so some people can make a lot of money. And we need to have somebody who has experience pushing back on that and making government work. Because I was originally told I had to choose between being an activist and elected official. I said I don't. The best elected officials are activists. And so I'm proud when I left the council, I was listed as the most productive councilman. I'm proud as public advocate. I passed more bills than almost all the public advocates combined in just the 2 years that I've been there. And that was important to me to show that there is a model of doing politics where you are pushing back on quote unquote normal and status quo on behalf of New Yorkers and making government work. And lastly, I'll say, you know, the party I belong to, the Democratic Party, is actually terrible talking about public safety and taxes in the economy. Those are two spaces that I'm very comfortable in, and I actually have been able to show productive, not just productive conversations, but actually produce results that have been beneficial.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. We'll wish you the best of luck, and we'll see you out on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessing, love and light again. And thank you everyone who's doing God's work and making sure people are fed and living in a safe and healthy environment.
Thank you. Do we have Andrew Giuliani with us? Andrew Giuliani is our next candidate here on the forum.
I believe we were a little ahead of schedule, so he should be jumping on momentarily.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. For people who don't know, we're going to be speaking with Andrew Giuliani, and then we'll be speaking with Rob Astorino. And if you're just joining us, we're providing interpretation of this event in 8 different languages, including Spanish, Bengali, Mandarin, Cantonese, Haitian, Creole, Russian, and Urdu. And to access these services, all you need to do is click on the global interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Select and click on your preferred language. There's also some ASL interpreters. So we heard from the Democratic candidates who are joining us. Errol, anything strike you as being especially interesting?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to hear people who have worked at different levels of government try to sort of hone in on what a state executive can do. So Tom Suozzi is a federal official. He's also worked at the county level. And of course, Jimani Williams has been a city council member and a public advocate. So he's worked in local government in New York City. When you're talking about trying to sort of figure this out for this big, varied state, you're talking about areas that are isolated and remote and rural, and you're talking about the heart of New York City. It is kind of difficult, I think, to sort of figure out the kind of policies that will work well in every setting, from Buffalo to Montauk. And these candidates, I think, are at the early stages of trying to iron all of that out.
Yeah, I was struck by Tom Suozzi's interest in unionization. I wasn't aware that he was such a pro-union guy, and encouraging unions is one of the things that he feels strongly about. He also spent a lot of time talking about corruption in Albany as not just in and of itself, but as something that costs taxpayer money, which is something that is absolutely the case, but we don't talk a lot about the fact that corruption costs actual dollars and cents.
Yeah, you don't hear it from Democrats so much. It tends to be coming from the other side of the aisle when people are concerned about those kind of questions. Like, he cited the oft-mentioned reality that New York has Medicaid expenses that are just completely out of line for a state of its size compared to some of our peer states. That's been true for as long as I've heard about this issue. That's like going back 25 years, you can hear people saying the same thing. Similarly, when you hear Jimani Williams talk about how the donor class really has a lot of outsized influence in the state capitol and are essentially not quite buying legislation, but they're certainly shaping the agenda in a very aggressive way, not necessarily because it serves the public interest, but because it serves their private commercial interest. That is absolutely true. And, to the extent that both candidates, I think, call it sort of small c corruption, not necessarily something you can go to jail for, but something that does twist the priorities of the legislature. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, when you look at, let's just talk about the Buffalo Bills Stadium or cryptocurrency or things that really will only affect a few people. They have lots of lobbyists. They're paid advocates to go to the state capitol and talk to the movers and shakers, the elected officials there. Just to put a fine point on it, the people who are sponsoring this forum don't have paid lobbyists, and therefore their voice at the state capitol is not quite as amplified because really they have to depend on earned media. Like this event would be considered earned media.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've heard you talk about it, what they call the Tin Cup Brigade.
Sure.
On Tuesdays during budget season. It's groups like the ones on this call. It's the groups that are doing human services, who are doing anti-poverty work, who are doing anti-hunger work, who come up and try to acquaint the legislators with their needs, with the different programmatic changes they can make, and most especially with the resource levels that are needed in order to make a dent in the problem. And it's somewhat contemptuously dismissed as, the Tin Cup Brigade, here they come
right,
again.
That's very not a great term to use. Yeah.
Right. And then
I've used it, but
and then of course at night they go out and have a nice, steak and lobster dinner with the donors who are looking for another tax break or another variance or some other kind of legislation that, lo and behold, always seems to make it at least into the later rounds of consideration.
Yeah, we're still waiting for Andrew Giuliani. And just to make sure people understand, Andrew Giuliani is the son of the former New York City mayor. He is surprisingly, some polls, a recent Siena poll says that he's one of the most well-known candidates running for governor this round. The fact is that we haven't seen a lot of Andrew Giuliani. We've seen a lot of Rudy Giuliani, but that's his dad. and the former lawyer for President Donald Trump. Andrew Giuliani also worked in the Trump administration. He was the associate director of the Office of Public Liaison and a special assistant to the president. And he worked on some interesting programs, including opioids, making sure getting money to programs that address the opioid addiction problem. I believe we have Andrew Giuliani. Are you there, Andrew? I saw that he joined.
Okay.
There he is.
I am here. Do you see me?
Is. Yes. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, Susan. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for joining us. I just introduced you while we were waiting for you. And I was hoping that you could just share a little bit about your background as it pertains to hunger and poverty and issues like that we're talking about tonight.
Sure. Well, I have, let me put this in right here. I have been very blessed as an individual, obviously, to never have to go hungry. And frankly, I haven't had many friends that have been in and out of poverty and dealt with it. So I'm not going to lie to our audience and tell you that this is something that I've personally dealt with. What I can tell you is throughout my time in Catholic school, we spent a lot of time at food pantries. I spent this Thanksgiving, as a matter of fact, in Staten Island, giving out food. So this is something that really, I think more than anything, even less as a gubernatorial candidate, more as a Catholic, this is something that is of interest to me. So I can't say that this is something that is of deep background to me, but certainly something as somebody who cares about this state, about this city, and certainly that somebody that is a faithful follower of Christ is something that I'm focused on.
All right. So let me ask you about some policy from when your dad was mayor of New York City. At that point, a federal judge had ruled that Mayor Giuliani had violated federal law by preventing eligible city residents from obtaining federally funded food stamp benefits. I know you can't speak for what your dad did when you were a kid, but do you think that your father was correct to have done that or not?
Well, I'm honestly not aware of that policy in particular, to be perfectly honest, Susan. I can just speak to the general change that we saw in New York from the time that he got into office to when he left office. And I think we all can agree that a city that is safer, that has more jobs and more opportunities, generally means there are less hungry people there. So for me, I'm very proud of his work as mayor. I'm not in on that court case in terms of being aware of the details of it, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. Andrew, it's Errol Lewis. I wanted to ask you about child poverty. It's a significant issue in New York State. In Buffalo, the child poverty rate is 44%. In Rochester, it's 48%, which is actually the highest in the nation. And in the Bronx, it's over 40%. This has been the case for decades. There doesn't seem to be an end in sight. In some cases, not much of a strategy. So with almost half of our kids living in poverty in major urban centers around the state, is it possible to have a healthy local economy? And if you agree that it is a serious problem, what policies would you put in place to address child poverty?
I think first and foremost, more than anything, I would want to make sure that we are partnering with private organizations that are leading the way on this. I don't think creating or government programs is the answer to this. I mean, the one thing that I can say that's consistent with Erie County, Monroe, and the Bronx, as you mentioned, Errol, is we've seen crime rise over the past few years. I think it's obvious that wherever we see crime rise, you're going to see continued poverty. You're going to see continued food insecurity problems. And as we all know, one of the major drivers in food insecurity and poverty is household dissolution, whether it be through divorce, whether it be through death, or whether it be through abandonment. And then the second biggest driver is job loss. So for me, that's why from our standpoint, it's making sure that New York is a place that is a job creating state, not a place where we are losing more jobs than any other state in the country. As we did over this last year, we led the country in out migration. That's less opportunities for people. I'm also focused on making sure that we have people that are not focused on being dependent on government programs, but more focused on making sure that there are more jobs and more opportunities from government. I would look at it as how can we partner? How can we create tax credits maybe for private philanthropies, for even businesses that are creating jobs, or from a philanthropy perspective that are doing a good job in feeding the poor. I don't think this should be something where we are expanding a government program, to be perfectly honest.
So you're saying that instead of committing to certain government programs or funding government programs, that you would depend on the private sector to help the children in poverty that Errol was talking about. Can you give us an example of one program that a private company funds and supports that has been successful in lifting children out of poverty?
I cannot, Susan, but what I can tell you is I would focus on making sure that we look at programs and we create programs and work with the experts in this, like Joel. As I mentioned before, this is a place where I am not an expert and I don't pretend to be an expert. And that, to me, is what the definition of a good leader is. I understand where my strengths are and understand where my weaknesses are. And I would want to make sure that we have the experts in childhood poverty, in making sure that we are feeding our children here in New York, involved in these decision-making processes. But I would much rather see a situation where, if we are going to use taxpayer dollars, where we are working on grants, or where we're working on actual tax credits for private organizations to be able to do this. I don't think this is something where we should create another bureaucratic system under Albany, or increase a bureaucratic system under Albany. And I don't think that's the answer.
Andrew, there's been some discussion tonight already of something that often comes up as a criticism of life in the state capitol, which is that wealthy donors, those who have financial interests, end up getting the ear of the governor, of the legislative leaders, and end up shaping the agenda, and frankly getting a share of the public dollars and other resources that could otherwise go to deal with poverty and hunger. The recent state budget included, for example, $600 million in public funds to build a new football stadium. Do you think that kind of a project is necessary? What would you do if you were governor about those kinds of pressures from the private sector to provide public resources for things like a suburban stadium outside of Buffalo?
Well, I have certainly my concerns with that project, especially considering the governor's family, the governor's husband's connection with profiting from that, whether it be from the concessions or the lobbying contract on this. So I would love to see more information. I hope the governor will be more transparent on that. Look, as a Giant fan, I understand and get teased all the time that the Bills are the only team that actually play in New York State. So I don't want to see New York lose the Bills. That's very important as somebody who enjoys their sports and who understands the importance of sports in a community right there. But I do think in examining the new contract and examining the fact that it is remaining in Orchard Park rather than being in downtown Buffalo, I have my concerns with how many long-time jobs this is actually creating, both within the Buffalo Bills organization and obviously, in the Buffalo area. So I certainly have my concerns with the project, both considering how close the governor is to it with her husband, and then just in general for it in terms of will we actually create the kind of jobs that we think we actually should?
So, Andrew Giuliani, you mentioned that you would listen to the experts, like the ones who are sponsoring this forum, if you were governor. And we're lucky enough to have some of their wisdom tonight, and many of them say that they would for example, raise the minimum wage. They would also ensure that SNAP benefits were more fully funded, or make it easier for New Yorkers to obtain SNAP benefits. So that being said, how do you respond to that?
So my response is, I do not believe that raising the minimum wage is the answer to this. I think it's actually another way in which we can continue the outflow of outmigration from the state. I think we need to understand that we are competing with 50 other states, and that's the one thing. If it was just in a vacuum where you could keep people in New York no matter what, then that would be a potential option which you could do it. But that's not our country. That's not the free economy, and that's not a way where we can actually that's viable. That's been proven to be viable. And in terms of SNAP benefits, what I would love to see is some tax dollars actually spent on getting people off SNAP benefits as fast as possible, whether that be through actually more unemployment, through bridging employment, I should say. But I think we all know, and we've all seen, that if somebody who has been on SNAP benefits for over a year versus somebody who's been on SNAP benefits for less than 6 months, I believe the number, and correct me if I'm wrong here, and Joel, please feel free to chime in. I believe the number, if somebody has been on SNAP benefits for over a year versus less than 6 months, that person or family that's over a year is 3 times more likely to never actually not be dependent on those SNAP benefits. Is that correct?
Not sure if Joel can speak.
Since you addressed me, I've been working on this a few decades, and I've never heard that statistic before. The vast majority of SNAP recipients do come from working families, and the vast majority are working people, children, and senior citizens. The percentage of able-bodied people who just aren't employed is generally less than 10% of the caseload.
May I ask then, is there a relevant statistic that you have that shows the time on SNAP benefits versus time off of it that I could share that would be something that would, I don't want to say confirm that, but would further my education on this, as this is what I've seen?
Before the recession, the average length of time on SNAP benefits was about 8 months. Another statistic I point out, the number of Americans who are sometimes poor is 10 times the number of Americans who are always poor.
Always poor. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, you know what? Well, I've got a related question, Andrew. There are states that that index their minimum wage so that they keep up with the rising cost of living. I understand you're skeptical about raising the minimum wage. Do you feel the same way about indexing it so that whatever the level is, at least it keeps pace with inflation?
Yes, I would explore that. And I think right now, in looking at inflation and how I wouldn't say it's out of control, but it feels certainly out of control. Obviously, as a candidate, we're traveling the state, and it's very expensive to fill up our car getting from place to place. So when you think about the type of pressures that are on each family, whether it be heating their home, whether it be actually gas, whether it be what they're seeing at the grocery store each and every day, where prices are continually 5, 10, 15% more than they were 2 years ago. That's something that I would have a conversation about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Errol,
So
sorry.
you've called for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I mistakenly said that's something I would have a conversation with about, and I said, and I meant Errol, of course. So.
Okay, so you've said that you're calling for tax cuts, Andrew.
Yes.
How likely is it that if you reduce state revenue, that you would need to cut some of the very programs for low-income people that we're talking about tonight?
Well, I think there is I don't want to say perfect number, but I think there is a target number that we need to get to as a state where we're more competitive with other states. And we're, like I said, we're not leading the country in out-migration. I think we saw this, and one example that I like to use, and it's not hunger related, but certainly with the hotel tax, let's say from 1993, when it was at 23%, and in 1994, when it went down to 12%. They actually in 1994 were able to make $100,000 more off of the hotel tax. And by the time you got to 1997, it was over $1 million more from the hotel tax, specifically in New York City. So I don't think that raising taxes is the answer. And you know what? Eliminating taxes is not the answer either. But I do think right now, reducing taxes will be better from a job creator's perspective. I think we will see more people that will decide to actually stay here in New York. I know a lot of people that have decided to leave because they do not like the fact that the government is the senior partner in their relationship here in New York. And I think we don't have to look further, Susan, than the fact that New York is leading the country in outmigration, and Florida is one of those states, or Texas or Tennessee is one of those states that is actually gaining more and more people. We could just see it from the congressional districts that we've lost, if we don't even want to look past those statistics. So for me, we need to be more competitive with those states.
Real quickly, though, I hear what you're saying, but aren't there lots and lots of help wanted signs in New York right now? I mean, I see them all over the place. I'm hearing about the Great Resignation. People are looking for employees. I mean, everybody is looking for employees. So if, you know, when you talk about giving tax breaks to job creators, I get that, but there seems to be a lot of jobs available right now.
I'm not aware of jobs. Say it again. Sorry, Susan.
There are a lot of jobs available right now. And, you know, if people need to get paid more in order, I mean, it's like it's Adam Smith, basically. You're not going to get more workers coming to your plant unless you pay them more.
Well, right now, New York City's unemployment rate is double the national average. At least that was as of 1 month ago. I'm not sure what this month's statistic is. So if that's the case, then I'm missing it. I haven't seen that, but you may be right, Susan. I just might not be looking in the right places.
Thank you. Errol, do you have another question for Andrew?
No, I think that brings us to the end of the time, actually. And I wanted to thank you for joining us, Andrew Giuliani.
Errol, Susan, Joel, thank you very much. I know on some things we may have a difference of opinion, but I really do, look forward to working with you. And I want to continue this conversation and seeing what we can do. Like I said, even more than a government candidate, I'm a big believer in the phrase, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, is maybe not the best, but I can tell you as a Catholic and as a Christian, this is something that's close to my heart. So I would love to continue to talk with you and work with you. And by the way, Joel, you have a great sense of humor. I was reading through one of your emails and I got a couple good chuckles out of it. So
thank
you.
You, Andrew. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. So again, we are waiting for Rob Astorino. I'm sure he'll be joining us shortly. So we definitely have a spectrum of candidates, don't we, to choose from, Errol?
Oh, for sure. Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh, look, there are, it's really striking how, if you think about it, with one exception, you and I have talked about this, Susan, there's been a Cuomo on the ballot for statewide office every cycle since the late 1970s, with one exception, I think in 1998. So we're really at the end of a super cycle, if you want to put it that way. That we've had two generations of Cuomos, and it's a particular way of looking at government. It's a particular way of looking at hunger, poverty, the economy, Albany itself. And so, what I'm finding tonight is that some of the questions are actually big questions that, we're going to have to try and figure out as a state, and certainly the hosts of the event are going to have to try and figure out a new way of doing business.
Yeah. In a
brand new Albany.
Yeah, the issue that you brought up, I think it was with Jumaane, about the difference between charitable and retail food is a really big question, because they work together. Food stamps, rather SNAP, and the food banks. Everybody works together to make sure everybody is fed. But at the end of the day, people there's a stigma attached to everything here. And so it depends on, people need to feel comfortable with how they're getting food. Oh, I'm losing my battery. I have to plug this in. Excuse me.
I hear you, Susan. The question, I think, is a very good one, because we have a system, if you want to call it that, where all of the heavy lifting is done at the policy level, right? This is something I've just learned over the years from dealing with the organizations represented here, that there is no substitute for SNAP. That you can have
Right.
all of the the best, most dedicated, most efficient pantries and soup kitchens imaginable, and you're still only getting a fraction done of what one change in policy can do if you move the minimum wage or you move the benefit levels, in some kind of a significant way. So, I think we're going to have to educate a lot of these candidates about that. I think the last candidate was a literal example of that. We got to bring them up to speed. They're moving around looking for votes. They're not, and they're looking for policies that make sense, but they're not really doing deep dives into what's really going on in Rochester or Buffalo or the Bronx or any place, really.
Yeah, no, and an issue like hunger and poverty, these are very dense issues. I was talking to Molly Nickel, who runs the food bank of Northeastern New York, and she was helping me prepare some of the questions that we're asking tonight. And some of the, they're so complicated. The issue is so dense that it's hard to even wrap your mind around it. And we're journalists, that's our job. And for these, for candidates who haven't been immersed in these issues, it must be daunting for them. I would love to see more candidates, though, spending time with these issues, because they really are the critical ones, and hunger does not have a lobbyist in Albany. I really feel strongly that it's up to us to make sure that hunger has a voice, and that we ask the candidates about these issues and poverty as well.
Right. Well, but even that, right? Normally the way the silos work in Albany and everywhere else, even at the county and the local level, is that there are anti-poverty programs and there are anti-hunger programs, and they're serving the same people, but they're led differently, they're funded differently.
Absolutely. The money comes from different pots, and they don't speak to each other. It's definitely, if we just got together with Joel and some of the people here, we could probably figure out some strategies to streamline this, but that's for another program. Again, we're waiting for Rob Astorino. He is a former Westchester County executive, previously served on the Mount Pleasant Board of Education, spent his life in Westchester County. He's also a radio guy. I think he worked for ESPN Sports, perhaps, and with Michael Kay. Are you a sports guy, Errol?
I am not, but I am a radio guy. And he worked in ESPN at ESPN for a while, and has hosted shows and so forth, and is a very good broadcaster. He's, as we'll see when we talk with him, he's got a very good style that works well. And not my job to compliment any of the candidates, but he is a very good, he's a good broadcaster, good communicator.
Yeah. No, he's definitely a very good communicator, and I believe he's joining us now. Rob Astorino, yes, there you are. How are you?
Hey, Susan. Hey, Errol, what's happening?
Hey, good to see you. I, in part because I grew up in Westchester, I was just explaining a little bit about your broadcast background. As we said, he's the former Westchester County executive. Rob Astorino did serve on the Mount Pleasant Board of Education, the Mount Pleasant Town Board, and was a member of the Westchester County Board of Legislators. He is running for the second time for governor. He was the Republican nominee a couple of cycles ago, and he's decided to join us, and we're grateful to have him. And Rob, what we're asking each candidate to do is start by briefly describing the work that you do and the approach that you would take in dealing with questions of hunger and poverty across New York State.
Okay. Well, first of all, just for the whole meeting, you can see over my head my name, so you'll never forget it. I served as Westchester County Executive for 8 years. Westchester is a pretty interesting county. It's 1 million people. Most people at first glance, certainly around the country, think it's a very wealthy county. It does have a lot of affluence, but it also is a very diverse county in so many different ways. And we've got urban areas, we've got the suburban feel, we've got the rural areas. So it is very diverse in its makeup. And with that comes a lot of issues that people don't associate Westchester with, including hunger and food insecurity. And it's something that we had to grapple with for 8 years, because when I first became county executive, we had a huge deficit, and taxes were the number one issue, where even a lot of Democrats voted for me in a county that is very Democratic. So we had to deal with a lot of issues. We had to balance a budget, and we had social services. Our biggest department was the one department in my budget in my 8 years where we actually added money overall. And it was because of the big need that we had throughout my 8 years, where we had the recession, in 2010 and 11, some of those difficult years we were coming out of. And we're kind of dealing with a lot of that now with, coming out of COVID and inflation and the economy where people are struggling, homelessness. So food insecurity was a big issue. I dealt with Food Bank of Westchester, attended almost all of their events. We had a really good working relationship. And we actually did some innovative things in the county. We had a food digester pilot program that we did, where we took food waste and actually put it in this big machine. And then we used that to create food gardens. And we did that at our county jail. And it was a wonderful program. We also did a pilot program, which we expanded, where we worked with restaurants, institutions, and captured on a daily basis meals that otherwise would have been thrown out that were perfectly good meals still, whether they were prepackaged or meals that were cooked. But instead of going into the garbage, they were actually collected, and we brought them to homeless shelters, places that needed the food. And Food Bank of Westchester was something that grew tremendously in my time there. They were actually revamped. The warehouse there is enormous. And I think it was 1 out of every 5 people in Westchester had food insecurity, which is not something people would associate Westchester with, but it is and has been a big issue.
Okay. After Hurricane Sandy, while you were Westchester County Executive, you encouraged county residents to apply for federally funded disaster SNAP benefits. Mm-hmm. Do you think those kind of benefits should be equally available to people who are facing poverty in situations that are, from their point of view, a disaster, but not necessarily natural disasters?
Yeah, I would take it on a universal level too. I think you hit the word that is part of food insecurity. We shouldn't necessarily just say there's hunger or food insecurity. It stems from poverty. It stems from a lack of housing. It stems from an inability to have employment and move up. And so the cost of living in New York is so expensive that people find themselves slipping backwards and into or out of whether it's poverty, unemployment, situations in their life that brings them to a difficult time, and going with that becomes hunger or food insecurity. So yeah, we wanted to make sure that supplemental nutrition assistance programs were available for people who needed it. We worked, and it's something that my family and I have done for many years. And I tried to do it to highlight it as county executive, just because the attention it can bring to get other people to volunteer. But we would volunteer, and there's something we wanted our kids to learn too, to help, and that in the grand scheme of things, they're pretty lucky. And, we want them to know that there's people who aren't as lucky. So we would always volunteer at shelters to distribute food. My son and I went to Peru on a father-son mission trip where we actually, worked with, we built houses, but we worked with and saw the most extreme poverty that you can imagine. So it's something that everyone should be exposed to and understand is right around us in our communities, whether they're the most affluent communities in Westchester or New York or elsewhere. But I think one thing we got to be careful about too is what we don't want is for generational poverty. What we don't want is for people to always need SNAP or meals. We want them to actually climb out of this and be in a stable household, stable environment, stable employment, and to move ahead. So the goal should be they don't need government assistance or charitable assistance.
Sometimes people do, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. When he was president, Donald Trump proposed slashing federal SNAP benefits, which would have also decreased the number of children receiving free lunch at school. Would you agree with that proposal? And to that point, do you support universal school meals for public school children?
Again, this is where we might differ, or I might differ philosophically with some. The more we do universal everything, the more expensive it is, and it just becomes that cycle. So I do think there is a need, and I do think that there is sometimes a need in people's lives, but the goal should be to not stay with that need. The goal should not be to never want to get out of it. One of the things that we did in our social services department, which was nationally recognized, it was a pilot program. One thing that I had really in discussions with people who were on public benefits or who were falling back in arrears in child support, let's say, and we had what I thought was a really very well-received program and much needed program, and that was a fatherhood initiative. Under every study imaginable, if a father is not present, especially in their children's lives, the likelihood grows exponentially that those kids are going to end up either in poverty, not go to college, just fall behind in every aspect in life as they go forward. But what we found was the fathers wanted to get back into the lives of their kids. And by the way, the single moms were now shouldering the entire burden. But they fell into this trap where if they did gainfully get employed, oftentimes they would fall backwards on income and not be able to afford it. And staying on welfare or the benefits was economically advantageous. That is not what we should be striving for, just to have a social safety net that will hold everybody at all times is not what the goal should be. The goal should be, it should be there to catch people, but eventually get them back into stability. So universal, I don't generally favor universal all the time for everybody. I think that leads to eventually unaffordability. And
what
again,
about cutting federal SNAP benefits?
What's that? Well,
cutting.
I'm not going to say that I understand where the benefit levels are right now. I know they're constantly being expanded, and the more we expand, the greater the amount of people that are going to be on it. And once people are on it, it's hard to get them off it. And I think that's one trap we can't fall into.
Didn't COVID though really make the social safety net pretty leaky? And at least for the time being, we need to help people with SNAP and WIC.
Yeah.
And things like that.
Yeah. But I think what you said was right. Time being, if we do universal, that's forever. And that's why I have problems with once you start these programs, it is almost impossible to end them. And I think the goal should be to have as least amount of people as possible on it forever. And as I said at the very beginning, always people, the safety net should be strong, that it helps people get back on their feet. But that also means accountability. And, that's the one area I had some friction when I first got into office, because it was always, and again, I was trying to balance. It was always about trying to balance what we could afford and what we needed. And I think those are, the wants and the needs always get in the way. But the needs are the ones that are most important. And that's what we really focused on. There were a lot of wants, but we focused on the needs. So accountability within social services, but also making sure that people who were eligible and needed got on what they did, what they were able to get for benefits. We wanted to make sure, especially those in broken households, single moms and children. Those are the programs that we focused on.
Thank you.
The concerns you're talking about, Rob, are what the sociologists would call moral hazard, meaning, you give people something and then you sort of run the risk that they're going to remain dependent, and you're now competing with the market. On the other hand, we have a provision of the state constitution. Article 17 requires the state of New York to provide for the aid and care of the needy. There's also the reality that the basic public assistance grant has not increased over the last decade. I think the upstate number, Albany County, the maximum benefit level is $367 a month for a single individual, and up to $698 a month for a household of 3 that has kids involved. Do you think that that's too high, or that's enough to keep people in permanent dependency?
No, I mean, honestly, given the cost of living and the lack of housing and support services, obviously that's not going to be enough, generally speaking, for people, right? So wouldn't it be better to have less people who can actually move up the ladder and move them up there, and have a program that could go wider if necessary for a shorter period of time? But that's why I think programs that are universal, that will start and never end, makes it more and more unaffordable in the long run, and can do the opposite of what the intention is.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying, I do think, I mean, obviously, for a family of 4 or a single mom with children, trying to get by on a couple $100 is not going to work. It's just, it never will work.
Another way to help people living in poverty is by increasing the minimum wage. And currently the minimum wage is $15 an hour in some parts of the state, as you know, but even that isn't really enough to accommodate for inflation, according to some of the experts on this program. So there's a push now to increase the minimum wage to $18 an hour. Is that something that you would support?
No. Look, people need to, and by the way, and the studies show too, most people on a minimum wage job that is not their full-time job. That, I mean, it's a small percentage of those. You're talking minimum wage, generally speaking, are transition jobs, college jobs. Yes, there are people trying to get by on minimum wage jobs, but the goal is to get them trained and moved up to better opportunities. We could go on and on and on. I mean, what's the number going to be? 18 will soon become 21, which will become 30, and you've got small businesses
to inflation.
Well, but inflation is a matter of in many ways government spending, which is, you're now chasing the tail, and it'll just spiral. So what good is a minimum wage job if you can't get a job? And I can tell you, what was about 30% of the small businesses are now permanently out of business, after COVID. And I can tell you, I talk to franchise owners of small businesses, they can't hire people. And they certainly, at $15 an hour, it makes the profit margins, and ultimately businesses are in for profits, almost unaffordable, their businesses. And then when you throw everything else in New York, that New York requires, that the cost of doing business in New York becomes astronomical. No, I do think that why don't we just do $25 or $100 an hour? I mean, that'll make it a lot easier for people receiving, but nobody's going to be able to afford to pay those salaries, so we won't have those businesses. So again, to me, everything has to be balanced out, and it is extraordinarily hard for businesses, especially smaller businesses, to do business in New York, and that will make it even worse.
Errol?
To the extent that we're shrinking the size of government the way you're describing, and cutting taxes, which you and some other candidates have called for, doesn't that reduce state revenue? And wouldn't that then translate into programs being cut that are supposed to be helping low-income New Yorkers?
Well, let's start with $400 million to Hollywood. Is that a necessary program? I mean, there's in a budget as huge as New York's, and even as big as Westchester's, there was a lot of money to really look at. So I went all 8 years. I inherited a budget of $1.8 billion. I left 8 years later with a $1.8 billion. But as I said at the beginning, along the way, we increased money to the Department of Social Services. We did that because we were able to reduce the workforce through attrition, reorganize, and look at the programs that were working and didn't work. I'm all for spending money if it's done the right way and for the right reasons. I'm not in this to just throw away money or to keep giving money with no accountability. And unfortunately, in government, things just chug along and nothing ever gets stopped or slowed down or questioned. And that comes at the expense of something. So I would rather spend $100 knowing it's going to people who actually need it than be spending $300, $200 of which is for benefits for government employees and all the other things that go along with it. I didn't even talk about, by the way, what my job was after I left county executive. So I had two jobs mainly. One was to be the Republican piñata on CNN, which was actually fun. I saw Errol over there plenty of times. It was actually fun to do, but I was the Republican on the air at CNN. But the other thing, and my main job during that time, Cardinal Dolan hired me to work directly for him and to help launch the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, it is a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit organization that is not affiliated with the Archdiocese of New York, but it has a board that is appointed by the bishops, and it falls under the charities law of New York State, so it's overseen by the Attorney General's office. The purpose of that, the sole purpose of that, is to spend down the $3 billion that they have, and hopefully, they'll have that for a long time with their investments, but to spend money to give to nonprofits and others on, there were 8 categories, but food insecurity and hunger programs was right up there. And these are the eligible programs, helping those previously incarcerated, new immigrants. These are the programs that I actually worked on for 2 years in developing and also in outreach to the community, but also giving and administering grants to these various organizations. Some went to Catholic Charities and their affiliates, but others went to nonprofit organizations. It was Catholic and non-Catholic, and it was great. And I also got to see different things that I wasn't really able to see as county executive, and I worked.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it was interesting, and it was for a great cause, and so I absolutely believe in it. I just believe that it should be done the right way, and I've seen the worst of it in how it gets abused and misused and wasted, and so often with government. But I also see how it goes directly into the hands of people who desperately need help as well, and how it can be done the right way.
Well, Rob Astorino, former Westchester County executive and gubernatorial candidate, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. Good to see you both. I see all these names on the board. It's nice to get to know you this way, and hopefully you'll be paying attention to the governor's race along the way. It's going to be a fun year, interesting year. But New Yorkers need help. They certainly do.
See you on the campaign trail.
Okay, guys. Thank you. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Great.
I want to both Errol and I want to thank all the candidates for joining us tonight. A full video of this event will be available at youtube.com/hungerfreeamerica. And Errol, I think that's it.
Okay. Thanks very much for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a